Hi all, today we will discuss top 40 Java with a Spring Boot microservice Kafka AWS real-time interview question, which is trending in 2014. So what all are the trending interview questions for this related Java with a Spring Boot microservice Kafka and AWS? So these all I search in the ChatGPT. So by using ChatGPT, we find this of 40 real-time interview questions with this Java with a Spring Boot, and these all are realistic. So I have given many of the interview, so I found this type of questions they are asking. So the first question they ask, what is a Spring Boot and how does it differ from the Spring framework? So yeah, so this is the main common interview questions which will be asked in all the company. So what is the Spring Boot and how it does differ from the Spring framework? So what is a Spring framework, what is a Spring, and what is a Spring Boot? Like that, they will change this patterns of the questions and then ask the same question: what is the difference between a Spring and a Spring Boot? What is the advantage of a Spring and a Spring Boot? How it differ from a Spring to a Spring framework to a Spring Boot? Like that. So this is the first question they will ask related for this. And the second question is, what is the advantage of a Spring Boot? While we are using the Spring Boot, what all are the advantage? So there some answers also is there. If you want, you can prefer the same answers here. So what is a Spring Boot and why we are using? What all are the advantage of a Spring Boot? So this is the advantage of a Spring Boot. And the next question is, how does a Spring Boot auto configuration work? So if we have a enable auto configuration annotations is there, through that we are doing this auto configuration work. So how we will work with this auto configurations in a Spring Boot? This. And the next question is, explain the purpose of application dot property in Spring Boot. So we have application dot property, we have application dot YAML. What is this property and YAML? What all are the differences there? So can you explain how we will externalize this configurations and all? So these type of questions they will ask. So these all are the part of Spring framework or a Spring Boot. We can say a Spring Boot or a Spring framework or Spring. So what is the Spring Boot starter? Give one examples. So what is a Spring Boot starter? So mostly we are using a Spring Boot starter web, MVCs and all. So these all are the. So why we are using and where we are setting this. So we have a dependency pom.xml there, in that we have to say. The next question is, how you will create a application, a Spring Boot application using a Spring initializer. So what is a Spring initializer? How we will create a Spring Boot applications in that? So this type of questions they will ask. And the next question is, how we will explain like what is a Spring Boot actuator, what all are the benefit in these actuators, why we are using a Spring Boot actuators. So if you will see this, so there are multiple questions are there, but these all are the common interview questions which will be asked by all the interviewer. So if you see here, the next question is, how does configure a data source in a Spring Boot? How does you configure data source in a Spring Boot? So there are multiple ways where we have YAML, where we have a property file. So application.yaml or application.property, there we have to use. The next question is, what is at the rate Spring Boot application annotation? This is very important questions, and how many annotations internally work in that. So configuration, enable, auto configuration, component scans are there. And the next question is the last question: how does we can create a custom Spring Boot starter? It's a very important question. How can we create a custom Spring Boot starter? Now the next questions related for microservices. So we are following, these all are the common microservice interview questions. So microservice have limited interview questions while you are going for the interview. So they will ask some limited question: what is microservice? How we have microservices? How we are creating? Why we are creating microservice pattern? What is monolithic and microservice? And then what all are the benefit using microservices? And the next question is, how do you achieve the communication in microservice? What all are the way to communicate in microservices? So there are multiple ways: Kafka, service discoveries, and all, REST API, like that. So explain this concept of service discovery in microservice. What is service discovery in microservice? And then what is API gateway and what all are the roles in microservice architectures, why we are using API gateways and all. The next question is how do you handle the data consistency in microservice? So there are patterns, some patterns are there like Saga patterns and all. So Saga is a very important questions. What is Saga patterns? How we will use this Saga patterns? Saga patterns mostly used for the distributed transactions and all. So that is the main thing. The next question is explain the concept of circuit breaker in microservice. What all are the circuit breakers? How we will use the circuit breaker in microservice? How to handle? Why we are using circuit breakers and all these things. The next question is what all are the best practice for designing the microservice? So how we will create a design the microservice either synchronous asynchronous ways, or how we will maintain the independent deployments and all. So these things we have to consider while we are creating a pattern of microservice based application. The next question is how does your monitor microservices? How you will monitor your microservices? So we have a multiple tools are there through that we will monitor like Elastic Logstash, Kibana, and actuators and all. So there are many patterns are there, many tools are there through that we can use to monitor our microservices. So next question is what is the difference between monolithic and microservices? This is a very important questions. So they will ask why we are creating a microservices instead of monolithic patterns are there. So this is the best examples here. Now we will go for the Kafka. So Kafka also have some important questions where if you'll go for the interview related for Kafka requirement, so they will ask this type of questions. So what is Apache Kafka and what are its main use cases? So can you explain the use cases of Kafka? What all are the examples? When to use Kafka? Why we are using Kafka? Like that. So explain the core component of Kafka. What all are the core component? Like we have a topic, producer, consumer, broker, zookeepers, and all. So why we are using these all Kafka? The next question is how does Kafka handle message ordering? If you want to ordering the message, so how the Kafka will be handled? So this thing, and then the next question is what is Kafka topic? The next question is how does achieve the fault tolerance in Kafka? And the next question is what is Kafka consumer group? Next question is how does Kafka achieve the high throughput? And then explain the Kafka partitioning strategy. How we will explain the Kafka partition strategy and all. The next question is what is the role of zookeepers in Kafka? How can we use, what all are the ways and what all are the roles? So mostly uh, zookeepers manage metadata through coordination. Brokers keep track the status of Kafka nodes topics to ensure the fault tolerance and all. So these all are the previous answers. If you want you can take as a reference. And the next question is how can we secure a Kafka cluster? It's a very important question. Using SSL for encryption, SASL for authentications, or ACL access control list for this authorization. For that purpose, we are using Kafka to secure the cluster. Now the next question is related for AWS. So if you are going for the interview of Java with a Spring Boot AWS requirement. So they may ask this type of questions. So what is AWS? What all are the service commonly service used in conjunctions with a Spring Boot microservices? So if you are going for the deployment or development of a Spring Boot microservices, so what all are the AWS services we need to use? So AWS services like AWS Amazon Web Service is a cloud platform which need to be used, and EC2 instance, RDS for database, EC2 instance for the compute, S3 for the storage, Lambda for the serverless, ECS or EKS is a container management. So for that purpose, we are using these all are the common services while we go for the development of this. Now the next question is how do you deploy the Spring Boot application in AWS? So by using EC2 instance, Elastic Beanstalk, ECS Dockers, Lambda serverless, deployment of CI/CD like Jenkins or AWS code pipeline we will use, and we will deploy our application in AWS services. Now the next question is what is AWS Elastic Beanstalk and how does it simplify the deployment? So it's used for the PaaS, like platform as a service. that automate the deployment, scaling, and management of application. So this type of questions they will ask. The next question is explain the use of Amazon RDS in a Spring Boot. So if you use the Amazon RDS with Spring Boot, so how we will use ADS is Amazon RDS relational database services, which is used to connect with the database if you are developing any applications by backend with the Spring Boot. The next question is what is Amazon ECS? How it is used with the microservices. So ECS is an Elastic Container Service. It's a fully managed container orchestration services. It allow you to deployment, manage, and scale the containerized applications. So mostly we use for the ECS in that case. The next question is what is the use of Amazon S3 in Spring Boot? It's a very important question. Most of the interviewers they will ask this time. Describe the use of Amazon S3. So Amazon S3 is a simple storage service can be used for the storing the file like backup, static content. A Spring Boot application can interact with S3 using the AWS SDK. So how you will interact with the Spring Boot by using AWS SDK. So we need to write some business logic in create a configuration class and other services class which have a AWS SDK. Through that we will communicate the S3 bucket. The next question is how does you configure AWS IAM role and policy in a Spring Boot application? So we have IAM role policies that we can handle and manage through the role access. The next question is explain the AWS Lambda and its use in Spring Boot. So AWS Lambda is a very important questions. Most of the interviewers will ask these questions: why we are using, how we will create a Lambda, when to use a Lambda's functionalities and all. And the next question is what is AWS Cloud Formation and how does it help for the microservices deployment? Cloud Formation provide a way to define and provision infrastructure as a code like IAC. It helps for automate and centralize the deployment of microservice to the other resource. The next question is how do you monitor the Spring Boot application in AWS? So this is a very important question. Suppose if you have developed applications and deployed on AWS, how you will monitor? So we have AWS X-ray is there. So that will be trace is used for the tracing, integrating with the third-party tools like Prometheus, Grafana, and all. So through that we can track our applications. So these all are the top 40 interview questions with Java, with Spring Boot, microservice, AWS Cloud Services, and Kafka. It's a very important question. If you are going for the interview or if you have already attended many companies interview, so you will follow these patterns like this. So if you find this, so there are many common interviewer will ask this type of common interview questions. So just take a reference. Here we'll have some suggestions and some proper answers is there which we find through the chat GPT. If you want you can take as a reference and then prepare according to that. Yeah, thank you. Also let me know if what type of interview questions if you are looking and what all are the next videos you are looking for this, so that we will create according to that. Yeah, thank you.